Religion is surprise. Well, that's a teaser for what we're going to talk about a little later today. Hi, this is Dale Byron, and this is Heartwork, the podcast where we do deal with poetry. And at the same time, we understand that the real purpose is how we feel, how clear we are after reading a poem, how inspired we feel, how healed we are from grieving. So, all those things I think poetry is amazingly adept at, but we have to remember what we are actually going for. Now, we're doing a series, and this is the fourth in the series about how to read a poem more powerfully, actually, how to read a poem and come more fully alive. That's a way that we can say what we're really up to here in terms of the kinds of effects that we would like. And yeah. So today, the principle that we want to talk about how, we're talking about a series of principles about how to have poetry be more powerful, more impactful, more inspiring, all the things we've been talking about. And we talked a little bit about speaking the poem alive so that if we give our own voice to it, literally our voice, that we can speak the poem alive. That's what we talked about in the first week. Pause for power, we talked about in the second week, which is the silence, all the work the silence has to do, or even the small pauses between and after words and after lines, etc. Honor the heart lines we talked about the week before or last week, where we're really working with honoring the place where the poem shifts often. It's like a critical piece of the poem, and it is something that we want to honor in our reading and our embracing the poem. This week, we're going to talk about savor the surprise. Savor the surprise. Now, oftentimes, well, let me just say it this way. Poems, my most favorite poems, the poems I love most, have some kind of surprise built in. And that's why we were talking about, as I introduced the video today, my religion is surprise is actually a line that was originally said to me by one of my mentors and friends for many years, Brother David Steindl-Rast, who is just an amazing human being. And what he was talking about is the idea that when we are surprised, that we are literally, it's like being enlightened. We're lighter on our feet, and a surprise that delights, a surprise that helps heal us, a surprise that gives us sudden insight. Sometimes we use the word epiphany in terms of a surprise that is just incredibly impactful. And so this week, I could have picked many poems, but I decided to choose one. My preference are always shorter poems. And so this one is actually a poem that I wrote some years ago. And it's a poem that, as the poet Ezra Pound says, if the poet is not surprised, speaking again about surprise, if the poet is not surprised, the reader will not be either. I've always loved that, because the idea, and I know many who follow this podcast are also writers and writers of poetry. And one of the things about writing that is, I think, so delicious is that it's that feeling of something coming through us. I've said it before on the podcast, hearing ourselves say things we did not know that we knew. That's where these surprises come through. Sometimes I like to say to people that if you will diligently, and I don't mean that like work, I'm just talking about if you'll show up, and write with some frequency, you can't help but cohere. And part of that coherence are having these surprises where you'll hear yourself say something and you'll go, and oftentimes, and again, whether you write the poem or somebody else writes it, that surprise is so delicious, so powerful. So this week, One of the principles about making more poems more powerful in the way we read them is to make sure that we don't rush past the surprise in the poem, that we savor the surprise. We really dig into it. Okay, let's get into the poem. It's called Sun Trail. And I'll tell you a story about this after the poem. Sun Trail. Wrote this many years ago. It goes like this. Look, look, the poppies, they are at it again. Look, look, the poppies, they are at it again, exploding on the hills with their deep yellow flames and supple hearts. The tender green pines, the blood red manzanita, the wild iris, low and steady. They all breathe the secrets of the dark soil from where the poppies come. And they bend slightly to praise these golden parachutes, who in turn pour themselves joyfully, opening without restraint up and toward the sun. As the black-bellied poppies, as the black-bellied poppies teach with tender care how to close up shop daily, to forget what needs forgetting, to forget what needs forgetting, how not to shrink from these sanguine spring hills at the first sign of happiness, how not to shrink from these sanguine spring hills at the first sign of happiness. Now, this poem came from a direct experience, many times hiking on this trail, which really exists. It's on Mount Tamalpais, and it is called the Sun Trail. And if you ever get to hike it, you'll know why. And the wild poppies in spring just cover this trail just with magnificence. And so I was describing that experience. And what came to me was this business at the end. This was the surprise, hearing myself say what I didn't know I knew, what that line that came through, which again was actually quite shocking as I wrote the poem, quite unexpected, when I said, how not to shrink from these sanguine spring hills at the first sign of happiness. And of course, what I was musing on was how often in my own life that I find myself being almost addicted to not being happy. You know, there's a kind of way in which not being happy and always seeing only the most difficult, not that the most difficult is not there, not that it doesn't need to be honored as well. Everything needs to be honored. But if we only see the most difficult, and if we get, a kind of addiction to being unhappy, then that's not very workable either. And so I think this line came to me, and it was both delightful and delicious when it came through. And it was not something, again, it was a surprise. It surprised me. And actually, in a way, continues to surprise me every time I read it. And I love the idea. I think I was beginning to cohere um, around this when I came to this line about, as the black-bellied poppies teach with tender care how to close up shop daily, to forget what needs forgetting. And it reminded me that each of us needs to, it's like we need a mentor to help us with building our own, can we call it a forgettery? We need to be able to start fresh again, sometimes over and over again in the same day, sometimes over and over again. And so oftentimes we need to create our own capacity for forgetting, a forgettery, so that we can start fresh again. Not to deny, not to ignore, but to place it in a certain context so that we can start over fresh again. I think that's so important. Look, the poppies, they are at it again, exploding on the hills with their deep yellow flames and supple hearts. The tender green pines, the blood red manzanita, the wild iris, low and steady, they all breathe the secrets of the dark soil from where the poppies came. And they bend slightly to praise these golden parachutes who in turn pour themselves joyfully, opening without restraint up and toward the sun as the black bellied poppies teach with tender care how to close up shop daily, to forget what needs forgetting, how not to shrink from these sanguine spring hills at the first sign of happiness. At the first sign of happiness. How can we not shrink from our lives? How can we honor the grieving, honor the difficult, but also honor the gratitude and the sheer happiness and sometimes sheer joy that we can experience? Thank you so much as we go on this journey of how to read a poem and feel more alive. We will continue it next week. So thank you again for your listening ear. And until next time and next poem, take good care of yourself. And if you can, someone else.